The neighborhood seemed pulled straight from a postcard. Rows of modest, two-story homes stood proudly, their shutters freshly painted and lawns meticulously trimmed. Trees lining the quiet street glowed in hues of amber and gold, the leaves drifting lazily to the ground. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of apple pie from somewhere nearby, adding to the sense of calm. Nestled near the end of the cul-de-sac stood the Mitchell house, a welcoming white colonial with soft yellow trim. The curtains swayed gently in the windows, hinting at the warmth within. But beyond the polished exterior and seasonal wreath on the front door, secrets stirred just out of sight. 16-year-old Claire Mitchell sat at the kitchen table, sketchbook open but untouched. Her pencil hovered above the page, forgotten as her gaze drifted toward the window. She was still, too still, her thin frame and tired eyes betraying months of restless nights. Her focus landed on the driveway, where her stepfather, Mark, unloaded grocery bags from the trunk of his car. To anyone else, he might have seemed like the picture of reliability, whistling as he carried the bags inside. But to Claire, there was something she couldn't quite place, something that felt off. Her mom's voice snapped her back to the moment. "Claire, honey, can you help Mark with the bags?" Lena's tone was warm, but tired. "Sure, Mom," Claire muttered, standing. She hesitated by the window for a moment longer, her reflection ghosted over Mark's smiling face. Mark greeted Claire with his usual charm, flashing a smile so wide it could sell $1 million home. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his button-down shirt crisp despite the busy day he claimed to have had. "Hey kiddo," he said, setting down a bag of produce. "How's the next Picasso doing?" Claire managed a weak smile. "Fine." He tousled her hair, a move she barely resisted. "Good to hear. We'll have to hang one of your masterpieces in the living room, huh?" Behind the charm, Claire noticed the way Mark moved through the kitchen. Precise, calculated. He rearranged the items Lena had placed on the counter, muttering about keeping things in order. "You know, I just want to keep this place running smoothly," he said to Lena, his tone light, but his words deliberate. Lena laughed softly, brushing it off, but Claire saw the way her mom's shoulders tensed ever so slightly. Later, as Lena flipped through a stack of medical bills at the dining table, her face softened when Mark entered the room. "You're amazing. You know that?" he said, kissing her temple. Lena looked up at him, gratitude in her eyes. "I don't know how I'd have done any of this without you. You've been my rock." Claire stood in the doorway, unnoticed, watching the exchange. Her mom's words settled in her chest like a stone. She wanted to believe them. She really did. But something about the way Mark's smile lingered after Lena looked away made her stomach tighten. That night, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. She rolled over, pulling her blanket tighter when she heard it, a faint, muffled sound. It came from below. She sat up, straining to hear. The noise came again, rhythmic and soft, almost like footsteps. "Probably the furnace," she muttered to herself, trying to dismiss the unease crawling up her spine. But when the sound stopped abruptly, her heart jumped. The next morning, over breakfast, she brought it up casually. "Hey, Mom, did you hear anything weird last night? From the basement?" Lena glanced at Mark, who was buttering toast. He didn't look up. "It's probably just the old pipes," Mark said smoothly, sliding the plate toward Lena. "I've been meaning to work on them. The basement's kind of a mess right now, under renovation." Claire nodded, but his words settled uneasily in her chest. As the days turned into weeks, Claire couldn't shake her unease. Mark's absences at night had become more frequent, his explanations vague. "Late showing," he'd say with a shrug, grabbing his jacket. Claire tried not to let it bother her, but each time the garage door hummed to life in the dead of night, her curiosity gnawed at her. She started paying attention. How long he was gone, how he avoided eye contact when she asked questions, how his clothes sometimes smelled faintly of damp earth when he returned. One evening, Claire came downstairs for a glass of water and stopped in her tracks. Mark stood in the living room, his back to her, staring at something on his phone. "Mark," she said quietly. He turned abruptly, his face unguarded for the briefest moment. The warmth, the charm. It was gone. His eyes were sharp, calculating, his jaw tight. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone as smooth as ever. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. Claire forced a nod, gripping the glass tighter as she backed away. Her chest tightened as she climbed the stairs. His cold expression burned into her mind. That night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't stop replaying the moments over the past weeks. The noises in the basement, the late-night outings, the look in Mark's eyes. The house felt colder now, the warmth from before replaced with a gnawing uncertainty. Something wasn't right, and she was going to find out what. Claire lingered by the basement door, her fingers brushing against the cool painted wood. It was locked, as always. Her curiosity had started as a flicker, but now burned like an unrelenting flame. Mark's words echoed in her mind. "It's under renovation. Nothing down there to see." But the renovations never seemed to progress. No tools, no signs of work, just his repeated insistence that the basement was off limits. That evening, as Mark grabbed his briefcase, Claire cornered him near the front door. "Why can't we ever go down there?" she asked, crossing her arms. Mark's jaw tightened, his friendly demeanor shifting ever so slightly. "It's a mess, Claire. It's not safe." His smile returned, forced and hollow. "You wouldn't want to get hurt." He ruffled her hair, but Claire stepped back. She watched him leave, her frustration growing alongside her suspicion. Mark's phone buzzed against the coffee table late one night, the screen lighting up the dimly lit room. Claire, curled up on the couch pretending to read, glanced at the message. The sender was unnamed. "It's handled. Let me know if there's a problem." Mark picked up the phone quickly, his expression unreadable. "Work stuff," he mumbled when he noticed Claire watching. He turned his back, his voice dropping as he spoke into the phone. Claire's ears strained to catch his words. No, not yet. We'll stick to the plan." When he hung up, Mark noticed her staring. His smile was tight. "Don't stay up too late, kiddo." The news blared in the background the next morning as Claire buttered her toast. "Police continue to search for missing 17-year-old Emily Carter," the reporter announced. A school photo of a smiling girl appeared on the screen. Emily was last seen leaving a friend's house late Friday night. Claire glanced at Mark, who had frozen mid-sip of his coffee. His grip on the mug tightened before he set it down. "Terrible," he muttered, his voice clipped. "This world's getting crazier by the day." "Did you know her?" Claire asked, keeping her tone casual. Mark's eyes darted to her, then to Lena. "Why would I?" he replied quickly, forcing a laugh. "I don't have time to keep up with every kid in town." He stood abruptly, brushing past Claire on his way to the garage. Her unease grew as the door slammed shut behind him. Claire sat cross-legged on her bed, chewing her lip as she stared at her laptop. Her gut told her something was wrong, very wrong. But her mind wrestled with the risks. If she snooped and found nothing, Mark would never forgive her. But what if she was right? She clenched her fists, the memory of Mark's cold demeanor flashing in her mind. I have to know, she whispered to herself. That evening, when Lena was at work and Mark was out, Claire crept into his office. Her heart raced as she scanned the room, searching for anything unusual. Her eyes landed on the desk. Kneeling, she tugged at the bottom drawer. It didn't budge. Locked. She hesitated, then grabbed a paperclip from the desk, working the lock until it clicked open. Inside, her breath caught. A small pile of fake IDs, a burner phone, and newspaper clippings of missing persons stared back at her. The articles spanned months, maybe years. Her hands shook as she picked up a clipping about Emily Carter. At the back of the drawer was a leather-bound journal. Claire hesitated, but curiosity overpowered her fear. Flipping through the pages, she felt her stomach churn. The entries were chilling. Cold, detached accounts of stalking, manipulating, and taking. Each one ended with a meticulous note. Done. Her eyes watered as the room seemed to tilt around her. The man her mother trusted, the man who lived under their roof, was a monster. Claire sat on her bed, the journal clutched in her lap. She felt trapped, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Do I tell Mom? What if she doesn't believe me? But keeping silent felt just as unbearable. The fear of what Mark might do next gnawed at her. Her chest tightened. If she confronted him without proof, she'd be putting herself and her mom in danger. The next day, Claire confided in Jake, her best friend. His eyes widened as she described what she'd found. This is insane, Jake said, running a hand through his hair. You can't do this alone. I don't know who else to trust, Claire admitted, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated. My brother's a cop. Maybe he could help. Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. We need to be sure first. I need more proof. Claire and Jake sat in the library after school, sketching out a plan. We'll track his movements, Jake suggested. If he's sneaking out, we'll figure out where he's going. Claire agreed, her determination outweighing her fear. Whatever it takes, we can't let him get away with this. The weight of their mission hung heavily between them as they prepared for the next step, the clock ticking ominously in the background. Claire's heart raced as she watched Mark pull out of the driveway, his taillights disappearing into the evening mist. She glanced at Jake, who stood beside her in the shadow of the porch, clutching his phone like a lifeline. Ready? She whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, though his hands shook. Let's just get in, find what we need, and get out. Quick. The house felt unnaturally quiet as they slipped inside. The basement door loomed ahead, its lock newly installed. But Claire had come prepared. With a paperclip and steady determination, she worked the lock until it clicked open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. Claire flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. Stay close, she said, leading the way. The basement smelled of damp concrete and stale air. Old furniture and dusty boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, but something about the arrangement felt deliberate. Jake tapped her shoulder and pointed. Look at that. Behind a stack of boxes, the wall didn't match the rest of the basement. The plaster was new, smooth compared to the cracked concrete around it. Claire's pulse quickened. Help me move these. Together they shoved the boxes aside, revealing the outline of a door hidden within the false wall. Jake ran his fingers along the edges, finding a latch. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "No kidding," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The hidden door groaned as it opened, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Claire's flashlight illuminated the scene, and her breath caught in her throat. The room was a nightmare come to life. Chains hung from the walls, a blood-stained workbench stood in the corner, and an array of tools, some rusted, others clean, were laid out with unsettling precision. Jake gagged, covering his mouth. "What the hell is this?" Claire stepped closer, her stomach churning. "It's worse than I thought," she murmured, tears stinging her eyes. Pinned to the far wall was a chilling gallery of Polaroids. Each photo showed a different teenager, their faces frozen in fear. Claire recognized some of them from the news, their names, their stories. Her eyes locked on one photo in particular, Emily Carter. The girl's terrified eyes stared back at her, and Claire's knees nearly buckled. Jake whispered, "He's been watching them, hunting them." On a small shelf near the workbench, Claire spotted a worn leather journal. She hesitated, then opened it, flipping through the pages. Each entry was more horrifying than the last. Detailed accounts of stalking his victims, choosing his targets, and justifying his actions. "This is insane," Claire said, her voice breaking. "He wrote everything down." Jake peered over her shoulder. "We need to get this to the police. Now." As Claire flipped to the most recent entries, her breath hitched. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "It's your sister. He's been talking to her. She's his next target." Jake's face went pale. "Number, no way. She thought he was helping her." Claire grabbed his arm. "We have to stop him, whatever it takes." They worked quickly, snapping photos of the room, the Polaroids, and the journal's most damning pages. Jake stuffed the journal into his backpack while Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. "We have enough," she said, glancing toward the basement stairs. "Let's go." The distant rumble of an engine froze them in place. Claire's heart dropped as she heard the sound of the garage door opening. "He's back," Jake whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Footsteps echoed above them, slow and deliberate. Mark's voice carried through the house, humming a tune as he moved closer to the basement. "We're trapped," Claire whispered, her eyes darting around the room. Claire grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward the far corner of the room. They squeezed behind a shelf, their breathing shallow and ragged. The basement door creaked open, and heavy footsteps descended the stairs. Mark's voice was calm, almost cheerful. "I told you not to come down here," he said, to no one in particular, his tone darkening with each word. Claire clenched her fists, her heart pounding as Mark's shadow loomed closer. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the Polaroids, the workbench, and the open journal. Mark stopped. The silence was deafening. Claire held her breath, praying the shadows would keep them hidden as Mark's steps grew louder, closer. And then the beam of light stopped just inches from their hiding spot. The beam of Mark's flashlight swept across the room, resting momentarily on the open journal lying on the workbench. Claire and Jake held their breath, pressed against the cold concrete wall behind a dusty shelf. Mark's steps were slow and deliberate as he crossed the hidden room, the sound of his boots echoing ominously. He picked up the journal, flipping through its pages with eerie calm. "I see you've been busy," Mark said, his voice low but carrying an edge that sent a chill down Claire's spine. The flashlight beam snapped toward their hiding spot, and Mark's shadow loomed over them. "Well, well," he drawled, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "Looks like the little detectives couldn't resist playing with fire." Claire and Jake stepped out from behind the shelf, their hearts pounding. Mark stood before them, his charming stepfather facade stripped away. His eyes, once warm and inviting, were now cold and calculating. "You've been snooping where you don't belong," Mark continued, pacing slowly. "I warned you, Claire. Some doors are better left closed." Claire clenched her fists, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "You're sick. You've been hurting people, ruining lives. How could you—" Mark cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Oh, Claire, don't be so naive. The world isn't fair. People like me. We take what we want. And I've been doing it for years. Your mother, your neighbors, they all adore me. They'll never believe a word you say." Mark's expression darkened, and he leaned closer to Claire, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You ever wonder why your dad's accident felt strange?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" Mark smirked. "Let's just say, sometimes obstacles need removing." Jake stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're lying." "Am I?" Mark said, tilting his head. "Or maybe I'm just better at playing this game than your dear old dad was." Claire's knees wobbled as the weight of his words sank in. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Mark straightened, his calm demeanor unnerving. "Look at you two. So brave, so determined to play hero. But let me tell you something. Nobody's coming to save you. This ends here." He moved closer, towering over them. "Do you know what I love most about this? Watching you squirm. Knowing you'll never win." Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "You won't get away with this." Mark laughed again, this time louder. "Oh, Claire, I've already won. The evidence? Gone. The witnesses? Well, soon to be." Jake's phone buzzed softly in his pocket, and Claire noticed him fumbling with it. She realized he was trying to send an SOS message to his brother. She swallowed her fear and stepped forward, drawing Mark's attention. "You think you're so smart, don't you? But you're just a coward, hiding behind lies and manipulation." Mark's eyes narrowed, but her words had the desired effect. He focused entirely on her, giving Jake the time he needed. "Careful, Claire," Mark warned, his voice icy. "You're treading on dangerous ground." "Why? Afraid someone will finally stand up to you?" She shot back, her voice shaking, but determined. Mark's patience snapped. He grabbed Claire by the arm and dragged her toward the basement door. Jake lunged, but Mark shoved him back with alarming strength. "Stay where you are," Mark barked, pulling a key from his pocket. He locked the basement door from the outside, trapping them inside. "You're going to regret ever stepping foot down here," he said, his tone venomous. "Don't bother yelling. No one will hear you." The door slammed shut, and his footsteps faded as he ascended the stairs. Jake slammed his fist against the locked door. "We're screwed. We're stuck down here." "No, we're not," Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. Jake turned to her, confused. "There's a crawl space," she explained. "I found it when I was snooping. It leads to the backyard." Jake's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" She nodded. "Come on, we don't have much time." Guiding him to the far corner of the basement, Claire knelt and pried open a small panel in the wall, revealing a narrow tunnel. The tunnel was dark and cramped, but Claire led the way. her heart pounding with every movement. Jake followed close behind, their breaths echoing in the confined space. They emerged in the backyard, gasping for air. Claire grabbed Jake's arm. "We have to go. Now." As they darted toward the street, the distant sound of Mark's voice carried through the air, shouting in anger. "Run!" Claire urged, her adrenaline driving her forward. The screen fades to black, leaving the ultimate escape uncertain. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the street as police cars screeched to a halt outside the house. Jake's brother, Officer Dan, was the first to charge through the door, his firearm drawn. "Basement," Jake's shaky voice echoed through the call. The officers stormed downstairs, their voices sharp and commanding. Claire and Jake huddled near the hidden exit, their faces pale and streaked with tears. "Over here!" Claire shouted, her voice cracking. Relief flooded her as Dan and two officers reached them. The hidden room came into view, and the officers froze momentarily, their expressions grim as the grotesque scene unfolded before them. "You're safe now," Dan reassured, pulling Jake and Claire into a protective hug. But the relief was short-lived as Mark was dragged in handcuffs through the front door, his face eerily calm. He locked eyes with Claire, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The basement became a flurry of activity. Evidence bags filled with Polaroids, tools, and Mark's journal were passed between officers. One officer whispered to Dan, "This guy's been at this for years. Look at these clippings, these kids. They're all missing." Dan nodded grimly. "We'll need forensics down here ASAP." Claire and Jake sat on the front porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the scene unfold. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched a bottle of water. "It's worse than we thought," she whispered, staring at the ground. "So much worse." Jake placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But we stopped him, Claire. We stopped him." By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Reporters swarmed the street, neighbors gathering in hushed groups. Mrs. Hargrove, who lived next door, shook her head in disbelief. "Mark? No, it can't be true. He was such a kind man." "I trusted him," Mr. Adams muttered, his voice heavy with anger and shame. "He coached my son's soccer team. How did we miss this?" The weight of Mark's betrayal rippled through the neighborhood, leaving everyone questioning how they had been so blind. Inside the house, Lena sat at the kitchen table, her hands covering her face. Silent tears slipped through her fingers as she stared at the photo of her and Mark on their wedding day. "How could I have been so blind?" she whispered. "I brought him into our lives. I let him near you." Claire stood in the doorway, her own emotions raw. "Mom, it's not your fault. He fooled everyone." But Lena shook her head, her voice breaking. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you." Her shoulders heaved with sobs, and Claire hesitated before walking over and wrapping her arms around her. "We'll get through this," Claire murmured. "Together." Claire tossed and turned in her bed, the faint glow of moonlight illuminating her tear-streaked face. Her father's smiling photo sat on the nightstand, a painful reminder of what Mark had taken from her. She jolted awake, a scream caught in her throat. The nightmare had been vivid. Mark's cold eyes, her father's car spinning out of control. Lena rushed in, holding Claire tightly as she sobbed uncontrollably. "I can't stop seeing it, Mom," Claire choked out. "I can't stop hearing his voice." Lena stroked her hair. "We'll find help, sweetheart. We'll find a way to heal." The soft hum of a clock filled the therapist's office as Claire sat across from Dr. Miller. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, but her voice was steady. "He said he killed my dad," Claire began, her eyes filling with tears. "I keep wondering if there was something I could have done to stop him." Dr. Miller leaned forward. "You were just a child, Claire. You couldn't have known. What you're feeling is normal, but it's important to remember that none of this is your fault." Claire nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know how long the healing process would take, but she was determined to try. Lena spent the next weeks clearing the house of anything connected to Mark. His belongings were boxed up and sent away, every trace of him erased. "Claire," she said one evening, holding a small box, "I found these in the attic. They were your dad's." Inside were old photos, a watch, and a letter her father had written before his death. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she read the letter, her father's words a bittersweet comfort. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. Lena's voice was firm. "I'm going to make this right, Claire." I promise. The courtroom was packed as Mark faced the judge, his demeanor smug despite the overwhelming evidence against him. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" the judge asked. Mark smirked, his voice calm. "Only that people are so predictable. They believe what they want to believe." Gasps rippled through the room, but Claire refused to look away. She needed to see this through. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all charges, a wave of relief and exhaustion washed over her. The neighborhood struggled to move forward. Parents held their children closer, and trust became a fragile thing. At the community center, a vigil was held for Mark's victims. Candles flickered in the night, their glow a tribute to lives lost and a reminder of the darkness that had infiltrated their community. Claire stood in the backyard, the winter wind brushing against her face. Lena joined her, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "We've been through so much," Lena said softly. "But I'm proud of you, Claire. You're stronger than you know." Claire managed a small smile. "We're stronger together." As they stood side by side, the first hints of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a chance to heal, rebuild, and find hope again. The moving truck rumbled away, leaving Claire and Lena standing in the driveway of the new home. It was smaller than their old house, nestled in a quiet neighborhood where the hum of lawnmowers and the laughter of kids on bikes filled the air. Lena turned to Claire, her eyes soft but tired. "What do you think?" Claire surveyed the house, its fresh white paint gleaming under the midday sun. The windows were framed with blue shutters and a garden of wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze. "It's different," Claire admitted, her voice tentative. "That's the point," Lena said, with a small smile. Inside, boxes were stacked against the walls, waiting to be unpacked. Claire wandered through the empty rooms, running her fingers along the cool, smooth surfaces. She paused at her bedroom window, looking out at the backyard. It felt strange to start over, but there was a quiet hope blooming beneath her unease. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated Claire's face as she sat at her desk, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. Her blog, titled "In the Shadows We Rise," had just gone live a week ago. Every day, more people found her posts, survivors sharing their stories, parents asking questions, and strangers offering support. Tonight, Claire was writing about her journey. No one thinks it could happen to them. I didn't. But the truth is, predators can hide in plain sight. They wear masks that fool even the people closest to them. Sharing my story isn't easy, but if it helps someone else, See the signs before it's too late? Then it's worth it. She exhaled deeply and hit publish. Lena appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of tea. How's it going? Claire smiled faintly. It's helping. At least, I think it is. It's brave, Lena said, placing a hand on her shoulder. And it's making a difference. The next morning, Claire sifted through the mail while Lena worked in the garden. Bills, a catalogue, a letter from an old friend of her mother's. And then, something strange. A plain white envelope with no return address. The postmark was from the state prison. Claire's breath caught. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. Inside was a single Polaroid of a man she didn't recognize. Dark hair, piercing eyes, a faint smirk. On the back, in neat block letters, was a chilling message. You missed one. The envelope fell from her hands as her chest tightened. Her mind raced. Was this from Mark? Was this man his accomplice? Claire? Lena's voice broke through her thoughts. She stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face. Claire handed her the Polaroid. It came in the mail. From prison. Lena's expression darkened. We need to tell the police. Claire sat at the kitchen table, the Polaroid spread out in front of her. She stared at the man's face, trying to decipher his connection to Mark. Was he one of Mark's victims who turned into an accomplice? A stranger Mark manipulated from the outside. Her anxiety grew with each unanswered question. The walls seemed to close in around her as the memories of Mark's crimes resurfaced. Lena entered, placing a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out. Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. I won't let him scare me, Mom. Not anymore. That evening, Claire stood in the backyard, holding the Polaroid and the envelope. A metal trash can sat in front of her, a small fire crackling inside. Lena watched from the porch, giving her space but ready to step in if needed. Claire took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. She tossed the letter and the Polaroid into the fire, watching as the flames consumed them. The edges curled and blackened, the smoke rising into the sky. It felt like a weight lifting off her chest. No more, Claire whispered. I won't let you win. Later, Claire sat on the porch steps with Lena, the soft glow of the firelight flickering behind them. I'm scared, Mom, Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. What if there's more out there? What if he wasn't working alone? Lena wrapped an arm around her. We'll face it together, like we always have, one day at a time. Claire looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly above. Claire looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly above. She thought about everything they'd been through, the scars they carried, and the strength they'd found in each other. The next morning, Claire stood in the backyard, the early sun warming her face. The ashes of the letter were gone, carried away by the wind. She closed her eyes, feeling the quiet determination rise within her. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her. As the sun climbed higher, Claire smiled faintly, ready to face whatever came next.